and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 59. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is the author of a brand new book, one that I had been impatiently waiting for months, and is finally here. It's surpassed all my expectations. It's blooming brilliant. It's called Peach Blossom Spring. Hello, Melissa Fu.
Hello, Charlie.
How are you?
I'm well and just thrilled to get to speak with you today.
I'm very excited. We said before we hit record about spoilers, and you're okay with spoilers, so it's going to be great, very detailed. You wrote this book, or at least some of this book, during a fellowship at UAE.
Yes, at the University of East Anglia. Much of the big draft that became the book was written and developed there. The fellowship is called the David T.K. Wong Fellowship, and it's meant for someone who is working on a book-length piece of fiction that focuses on the Far East or Southeast Asia. It's a wonderful fellowship in that you get a gift of time. There's a stipend and an office, and you just write. I had a mentor who I met with just about once a month, and I would send him maybe 10,000 words of the story, and we would talk over it. Then I'd go back and I'd just keep writing, and then I'd meet with him again. And so for me, I just knew this was a golden opportunity, and I thought I have to walk out of this by the end of the year with the whole story in a draft that tells a very bad version of the story I want to tell, but tells the whole story. And so it was just a lot of writing. It was a real magical year.
Well, I've got a question later that will fit into it, but we will get on to the book first. Peach Blossom Spring follows three members of a family, one after the other. There's a slight saga feel to it, which is great. It begins with the Japanese invasion of China during the Second Sino-Japanese War and the refugee crisis. Follows the characters to Taiwan, then to the US. So we're looking at identity, we're looking at a place to call home, we're looking at the impact of war and trauma on the generations. Melissa, I think this is a good time if we start with your reading.
Great, thank you, Charlie. So this is from the very beginning, so no need to set it up. And it's called Origins. Tell us, they say. Tell us where you're from. He is from walking and walking and walking. He is from shoes filled with holes, blistered toes and calloused heels that know the roughness of gravel roads and the relief in straw, in grass. He is from staying each night in a different place, sometimes city, sometimes country. From roads that wrap around mountains and dip through valleys, from waterways shrouded in fog and mist. He is from walking across China. Tell us your memories, they say. He remembers kerosene lamps burning low, the smell of wood smoke, cold stone floors under his bare feet, urgent voices, the rasping of coins, carts creaking at night. He remembers a sandalwood puzzle picture. One way up, there were 100 monkeys. Turn it over, there were 99. How did that monkey appear and disappear? He is from this mystery. Tell us more, they say as they nestle by his side. How did you come here? He crossed rivers. He crossed oceans. He carried a watch bought from a sailor, a letter to open doors, a suitcase, a packet of light blue aerograms, a single pair of wool socks. He went towards the call of a beautiful country, a beckoning dream, a promise made of air, towards wing beats of birds, kaleidoscopes of seasons he'd never imagined before. And now, they say, their eyes clear and voices playful, tell us a story. To know a story is to stroke the silken surfaces of loss, to feel the weight of beauty in his hands. To know a story is to carry it always, etched in his bones, even if dormant for decades. Tell us, they insist. To tell a story, he realizes, is to plant a seed and let it grow.
So I love the start of this book, and I like how at the end, although it's not the same sort of narrative that you've got here at the start, it kind of does cycle around a bit. I wanted to know, actually, what made you start on the note that you've just read? Was that always the starting point for the novel in terms of the narrative itself?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought up the end, because I did want the end to circle back around to those first words. And I'm so glad we can talk about spoilers. The very, very last scene is maybe evoking something that the character is thinking about, which is in the very first pages of the book. I think that once I decided to write this story, and it did start as a short story, I always knew that the first lines were going to be, he is from walking and walking and walking. And that came from a poetry exercise I was doing. I was teaching a writer's workshop, and there's a poem by a poet called George Ella Lyon called Where I'm From. And the exercise isn't to say like, oh, I'm from Los Alamos, New Mexico, and it's to make it more metaphorical where you're from. So I offered that to the participants in the workshop using her poem as a model. And I participated too, because I always try to do that when I'm leading a writing workshop. And I was going to continue with my example, which was, instead of saying, I'm from Los Alamos, New Mexico, it was going to be, I'm from snowfall and leaf shadow. And I was going to continue. But once I started, the line came, he is from walking and walking and walking. And I thought, oh, that's strange. And I just carried on with it. And much of that first section comes from that day. It surprised me then, and I just wanted to keep following it.
That's fascinating to hear. And it's going to seem sort of jarring, although I think anyone who's read the book isn't going to be jarred when I say, can you tell us about sort of the other starting point of the novel, Your Father and His Peach Trees?
Yeah, okay, great. So when I was a child, my dad was always trying to grow fruit trees, and they were always a disaster. They never really took root properly. Worms would get into them, tent caterpillars, hail, everything that went wrong did. And it was kind of funny, but it was also kind of sad. And then after he retired and he and my mom moved away from the town where I grew up to a bigger city, and I think he became a little more relaxed about his life in general, my mom bought some supermarket peaches, and I think he probably ate them all in a day because he was like that. And then he just threw the pits into the back garden. And the next spring, there were little seedlings. And my mom found them, and she said, oh, look. And so they just took care of these seedlings, and he was thrilled and really nurtured them. And kind of by the end of the last 10, 15 years of his life, he had this beautiful orchard of peaches, an accidental orchard. So I wanted to write a short story about that. And I did. And I showed it to some friends, and they were just like, oh, it's a fine story, but we think there's more to tell. Something's missing. And in that short story, by the way, that one did start off with the he is from walking and walking and walking. But I noticed that the way they were talking about the characters was really different from any sort of feedback I'd had before. I mean, they were just arguing about this character, Henry, and did he deserve an orchard? And what about his daughter? Because I was really just focusing in that short story on what would be the third generation in the book, the third part of the book, the interplay between Henry and his daughter, Lily. And that struck me that they weren't talking about craft. They weren't talking about narrative choices. They were really invested in the characters. So I thought, maybe I'll just try to make this bigger. And somehow I needed to know more about my dad, but I didn't know much about him, except I had some notes from one day when he told my oldest brother and me a little bit about his youth in China and Taiwan. And those notes were old. Those were from 1998. And this was about 2017, 2018 when I was writing this story. So I pulled them out and I tried to connect those notes to this frustrating short story that just seemed to be bursting out of its form.
It's really interesting. So you have effectively combined the facts and your fiction and put them together. Yeah,
the few facts that I had that gave me sort of an outline, a roadmap, so to speak, of what my father remembered. I mean, when he was talking about those notes, he would have been in his mid-60s, and he was recalling times from when he would have been, 9, 10, early teens. So to the extent that memory is reliable, those were the facts that I had from him.
Makes absolute sense, understandable. So we've got your father, and is it right to say there might be a bit of you in Lily?
A little bit. I think she's a little bolder than I ever would have been. I think at first I didn't really want to do much of her story. I just tried to make it as short as possible, actually. And then the editors were like, no, we've got to give her more space. So we've got to round her out. And so the more I made her a little bit less like me, the more fun it became. But also I found in her opportunities to kind of pour my ideas and things that I was thinking about now, or things I had wished I had said years ago. And I could make her a little bit of a mouthpiece for things that when I was the age that the character is weren't really on my mind, but I could imagine maybe a teenager with maybe a sort of 2020 sensibility or 2019-18 sensibility asking some questions a bit bolder. Yeah, so she became more fun. But the more fictional I made any of the characters, the more fun they were to write.
Well, yeah, you have Lily, you have Henry, and then, of course, we've got Meilin, who is completely fictional. Could you tell us how you came to create her and what went into making her?
I'd say she's not completely fictional, but mostly fictional. So she's based loosely on my father's mother, my paternal grandmother. We would call her Nai Nai. And so I met my own Nai Nai. She came to the States twice, and I went to Taiwan once visiting her. But I was quite young in all three of these instances. But I have really fond memories of what she was like, and quite visceral ones of like the way her hands felt, and that she was always making things, sewing or knitting or crocheting, and the way that she would hide treats for me and my brothers in her sewing basket. We'd come and find them, and she was always cooking. She was just always doing. So I tried to put as many memories, specific memories of her into the character of Meilin like that. But then the personality and the strength of the person, I could only sort of guess from what I knew from my dad. But then as I was doing research, after I got a basic understanding of, or enough of an understanding of the different wars and the different political camps of early 20th century China and Taiwan, what I became more interested in was people's stories. And in particular, women's stories were starting to bubble up in my research. So I found there was a wonderful book called Echoes of Chongqing, written by someone called Danke Li. And it was all oral histories of women who had made a very similar journey from somewhere in China to the western capital of Chongqing during the Sino-Japanese War, which is kind of the first bit of movement that Meilin and Renshu take. So I had all of those oral histories to draw on to just see the different types of challenges and difficult situations that they lived through and how they described them and how they found ways to solve problems, the ways they set up homes and kept the family together. So she's really based on drawing on as many of these oral histories and memoirs that I could find of actual people. There was another really influential memoir that I read, which followed someone not only to Chongqing, but then made the journey back to the east to Taiwan. And this is called The Great and Flowing River by a Chinese writer who lives in Taiwan called Qi Pangyuan. And that book, that autobiography, was just incredible. Yeah, so Meilin is a mixture of all these amazing women who are often forgotten, I think, in the general view of history, thinking of it as, well, it was the communists versus the nationalists, and Chiang Kai-shek had these battles, or there were these treaties. You know, all of that is important, vitally important, but also I'm interested in the families and the women who kept those families together.
Can you tell us about the experiences of the refugees and the women, of course, in China during the war?
From my research, the experiences of the women were maybe not unlike, some of what's happening in Ukraine today. They would be taking the family, fleeing to some kind of safety. And in this case, it was, if they had the means and the luck, it was to the western part of China, to the new capital of Chongqing. Men were often off fighting, trying to protect the country from the Japanese, trying not to lose ground. Although even within the Chinese army itself, there was a great divide between the communists and the nationalists, even during this Second Sino-Japanese War and even before it. So it was all quite fractured. And I think, women would just take what they had and make their way west with kids, bargaining for a place on the boat. And once people got to the city of Chongqing, it wasn't quite as developed. Some people would say is an understatement, as like Shanghai and Beijing. I mean, Shanghai was incredibly cosmopolitan during this time. And so a lot of the refugees felt like Chongqing was this real backwater. There weren't a lot of cars, for example, and the streets were quite steep. It's a rather mountainous city. And it was very, very, very crowded. Housing, not a lot of housing. So to get a room anywhere would be lucky. The thing is, once they got there, they thought they were safe because it was quite hidden in the sense that it's far up what we refer to as the Yangtze River, far west in the mountains. And for many months of the year, it's covered by fog. So it would have been harder for the Japanese to bomb. They're during the foggy seasons. So say from November to April, it was relatively safe. But after a while, once the Japanese found them, Chongqing was bombed relentlessly and mercilessly for about 5 years. They just got used to hearing the air raid sirens and taking refuge in tunnels. It was really dire.
Well, you've mentioned the tunnel there, and there is a horrible thing that happens. And also, you have the plane that is shooting at the refugees and things like that. Are these things that happened?
Yes, those are definite. So the shooting of civilians on the roads as they walked, trying to flee towards the west of Chongqing by the Japanese bomber planes just coming in kind of right at their feet. A lot of people spoke about that, especially in that book called Echoes of Chongqing. And I was just shocked, as were the people themselves. They knew there was a war going on, but it didn't occur to them that these particular bombers would just shoot at people who were just trying to get to safety. And the thing about that is, a lot of times after such a aerial attack, there wouldn't have been a lot of ambulances or medical care for the civilians because those resources were generally going to trying to help the soldiers. So a lot of people just suffered and were left on the roads, which is just one of the many tragedies. You mentioned the incident in the Great Tunnel in the area of Chongqing called Shibati, which means 18 steps. And there were 18 steps down into this particular great tunnel, which was dug to be a bomb shelter, but it was never designed for as many people who needed to go in, and people would just cram into it. It was one of the public shelters. What happened is that thousands of people would be in a space that was meant for not as many, maybe an order of a magnitude fewer it was really designed for, to the extent that you design a tunnel dug into the side of a mountain to be sheltered. But what happened in this particular Great Tunnel incident, and this is completely true, is that people would cram in and then they would close the gates. And there wasn't enough oxygen for people eventually, because they would stay in there for hours as long as the air raid was on. So lights started going out and people were suffocating and panicking and just clawing at each other and trying to get out. And there was a huge stampede just trying to get out because there was no air. And many, many lives were lost. The officials wouldn't open the gates because they said, we haven't had the official okay. And it was one of these huge tragedies, many of which there are in the Sino-Japanese War and continuing on into the Chinese Civil War, where there, sort of a lack of leadership and confusion at the top led to a terrible situation, even more tragic than it needed to be. So had there been better leadership, and this was, there was a lot of investigation afterwards, but it was maybe a mistake on the part of the government to not let people out. So the numbers of people who died, it is also very unclear. Like some people say, oh, there were only 200 bodies. And some people say, no, there were thousands. And it's very murky looking at the facts of this history. We talked about the few facts I had from my father, but even the facts of just what happened at different places during the Sino-Japanese War are murky because Chiang Kai-shek's government often wanted to cover up mistakes. And then, the records get lost. And I don't know, I've seen photos of the tunnel and the people after bringing the bodies out, people trying to claim their relatives. And I was just so saddened and moved by it. I thought, well, whatever the fault was, the truth is that people really suffered, and maybe it wasn't as necessary, or maybe, I don't know. So.
Oh, I mean, you've got a lot of things that are difficult to read, obviously, about the war, and that's maybe more difficult than some of the other parts. But I know that when I started to read that bit, I thought, well, there's going to be some history here. There's going to be some fiction. I really hope this bit is taken from a story and you've made more of it. And hearing that it's completely factual, that's... I don't know what to say on that one with that. Very difficult story to know.
I mean, if anything, I probably pulled back on the horrors of it. There's a book written by someone called Kim Zhang. It's called Accomplice to Memory, which is a really telling title about how memory is so difficult. And she writes in her book about this incident and just how confused all the reports were about it. She has a little bit of a similar background to me. In her book, she's written it as part memoir, part fiction, part photo essay. So it's a neat thing to me to see how different people have approached this sort of almost but not quite black box of a historical period, trying to shine some light on it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Your characters go to Taiwan, as we've mentioned. Can you tell us about how it was for Taiwan during the 1940s and 50s, if I say specifically in the way it was a place for refugees?
What it was like for the refugees to arrive in Taiwan in the 40s and 50s?
Yeah.
There were a few different waves in the 40s and 50s, or several different waves that went to Taiwan. So after the end of the Sino-Japanese War, as part of the Second World War in 1945, Taiwan had been a colony of Japan's since 1895 as a result of the first Sino-Japanese War, which I don't touch on. Mm-hmm. So Japan had colonized Taiwan, and while that was a very strict martial imperialistic type of rule, they also wanted Taiwan to be kind of a model colony. So they had put in a lot of infrastructure, and it was vibrant and filled with a lot of different people already. As part of the terms of 1945, they gave back Taiwan, which is a strange thing to say about a country, that you give it back to China. But anyway, China got control, nominal control. So there were some people who sort of turned up over there early on, asserting control, but the Taiwanese, it's their own country, they're their own people. And so there was already a bit of tension from 1946, 47, especially with the nationalists turning up there. Chiang Kai-shek hadn't yet come. He hadn't yet completely lost the Civil War, but there was a presence. Then, as it became clearer and clearer that the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek's group, were losing more and more of China, people were fleeing to wherever they could go that wasn't falling to the communists, and that included Taiwan, Hong Kong, if you had enough money and enough influence, Australia, the US. But a lot of people, in the end, about 1 million, there's questions about the numbers, but about 1 million people fled to Taiwan in late 1948, early 1949, the tail end of the Chinese Civil War. And they were refugees from China, except they arrived as sort of exiles, but with the attitude, at least the soldiers and the politicians, kind of with the attitude of conquerors. So they were sort of like, well, we're here to take the island back, and you have been Japanized. You should be grateful to us. But in fact, they were exhausted from what would have been, by that point, a decade of fighting. A lot of the soldiers' clothes were just in tatters. They were physically so tired. The families were just, hanging on to scraps. 1 million of them arrive in Taiwan. At that time, the island of Taiwan had a population of 6 or 7 million. So they just created this immediate housing crisis, and they needed to find places to live. And there was a real tension between the Chinese arriving from the mainland with nothing, expecting everything, and the Taiwanese who had already had established lives and livelihoods there. It's not that it wasn't welcoming, but it wasn't a sort of a smooth transition into living there. And many of the Chinese who went, they were known as Waishengren, which means people from outside the province. And the people who lived in Taiwan were known as Benshengren. Many of the Waishengren never thought they were going to stay in Taiwan. They thought it'll just be a few months and the Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek, will be victorious and we'll be going home. So there was a mentality, not only were they exiles thinking that this place was beneath them, but that they weren't going to stay. So many never quite adjusted to seeing Taiwan as home. And that also contributed to the tensions between the Waishengren and the Benshengren, which continued for decades, that sort of tension.
Thank you for your explanation. That's really interesting context to kind of rethink those scenes through and everything that's behind Meilin's experiences and things. Meilin has a hand scroll that she's been given by her husband, and it informs a lot of your book. Why did you decide to include it in your story as a concept and as an item in your book as itself, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I've been thinking about this. I don't actually remember when or how I decided to include it in the story. It was just kind of there, her scroll in particular. I think one of the things that struck me early on when I was maybe thinking about writing more about this story, kind of in that interim between the short stories not working and is it a novel and how big of a novel is it? I went at that time to the British Museum, and they have a scroll there, a hand scroll called the Admonition Scroll. Each scene on the scroll is sort of an admonition for the ladies of the Empress's courts, how women should behave. The translations, as I understand them, it's quite patriarchal and a little bit chauvinistic. They should serve the emperor and blah, blah, blah. But if you look at the pictures, the images, they really seem to undermine the story, the lecture bit. So there's one scene in particular where it's, I think, something about bravery, and there is a bear who is getting ready to attack the emperors where they're carrying him, and he looks scared to death and he's kind of cowering, and out in front facing the bear and fighting the bear is an empress, and I want to say her name is Empress Fu, but I'm not sure. And again throughout this scroll you get these pictures of the women actually being quite subversive, doing amazing things. And the very last picture on the admonition scroll, you can go to the British Museum and see it. They've got an amazing digital version of it. You can zoom in. In the very, very last image, there is one of the women writing a story. And I thought, oh, look at that. Maybe she's writing stories to tell. So that struck me. The other thing about that scroll is the first 3 scenes of the admonition scroll are missing. I mean, the scroll is, I want to say 8th or 9th century. It's very, very old, centuries old. Don't quote me on the 8th or 9th century. I'm terrible with dates. But I just thought the first 3 scenes are missing. And that's just like my father's life. At that time I was to myself, what I know of his early life, it's missing. I don't know anything. So I had a whole section in an early draft of the novel about that scroll and the idea, that these scenes are missing. In the end, it didn't stay in the book. But I think because of the admonition scrolls, I became interested in the hand scrolls in general and the traditions around them. And there's one that there's a copy of in the National Palace Museum in Taipei called Upriver During Qingming. And Qingming is a holiday in April where you go and you clean the ancestors' graves and remember the ancestors. And this particular scroll, it's got to be 10 meters long maybe, and it is amazing. It's really the inspiration for the scroll that I've imagined for Meilin. You see rivers and then marketplaces and palaces and mountains, and there's all this little detail, and you can just look at it for hours, finding animals doing funny things and people selling stuff in the market. And I just thought that would be such a wonderful thing to include somehow. And then in my mind, mothers tell stories. I really enjoyed reading my kids stories when they were much younger. And so it just seemed that that's what Meilin would do. If she has a 4-year-old, what's she going to do? She's going to tell them stories. And if she's got some pictures, even better.
Fascinating to hear. And that admonition scroll sounds absolutely awesome. I'm definitely going to get some links and have a look, and I'll put them in the podcast description for listeners as well. Yeah, it sounds brilliant. Talking about more of the characters themselves, Longwei's family, we lose some of them in different ways. Was this always in your mind to do, to kind of, for them to not be around so long and things like that, and for the family itself to kind of shrink?
Maybe not consciously. That's an interesting question. Was I always planning on shrinking the family? Because I do start off giving the sense of a huge family, and then it does funnel down pretty quickly to just a few key characters. And that was really intentional, that I wanted to give the sense of a big family. And part of that was a little bit of a nod to the idea that in Chinese culture, if you're asked, who you are or where you're from, I guess, the question isn't so much who you are as an individual. It's who are you in the context of your family, and who is your grandfather, and who is your grandfather's grandfather. And so I start off with that a very patriarchal nod to, if we're going to start the story, we start with a grandfather, because that's how my dad, when he started telling us about his early life, the first thing he said was, well, my grandfather had quite a few wives. And that's another line that's kind of the next from the section that I read. If you turn the page, the next line is, Dao Hongse had 3 wives. But what did strike me about these stories from my dad was that of all of those people, he was the only one left, he and his mom. And by the time he told us his stories, his mom had passed. So maybe at some level, I knew I needed to sort of shrink down. And Longwei's family, so he's Ren Shu, or Henry's uncle, brother-in-law to Meilin, and he's helpful, sort of, hindrance, sort of. He's kind of not quite sure, a little bit inscrutable. I had thought about keeping more of his family in. I had thought about having maybe some of them appear in China after the Cultural Revolution and maybe get in touch that way. That was just too much to take on. So the way that they got lost, initially I had them all kind of disappear on the boat that sunk, one of the last boats. This was another true bit. One of the last boats that left Shanghai for Taiwan in 1949, called the Taiping, which had taken several people, made several trips. And in fact, our characters took it to leave Shanghai to go to Taipei. I had Longwei's wife and 2 daughters on the boat, and on its final journey, where it collided with another boat in the night, they had turned off their lights so that they wouldn't be detected. And this is true of the Taiping, and it's kind of like the Chinese Titanic, and everyone was lost. I think pretty much everyone was lost. And the thing about it is they don't actually know all the people who were there, because in addition to the manifest, people were buying shoddy tickets and just squeezing on wherever they could because they were so desperate to leave. The boat was too heavy, really. There were too many people, which is part of the reason why it caused so many fatalities. So originally I had all of the family die that way. And then I think my editors were saying, well, no, we need to lose more characters and make it harder for the readers. So we have the younger daughter, Liling, who is a very, very dear friend to both Ren Shu and Meilin. She's the one whose life was lost in the Great Tunnel disaster, as we talked about earlier. And so that was, thanks to my editors, they're like, you've got to kill someone sooner. So, I mean, I had reference to it before, but they were like, it's one thing to refer to a historical event and your characters miraculously don't survive it, but they already have miraculously survived a lot of things. Maybe this is one place where maybe they lose something. But by narrowing down the characters, then we had Longwei. I think the experience of him losing his family, he also ends up in Taiwan, but by a different route as Meilin. They are separated, gives them a chance to have a kind of a reckoning of, they've known each other for so long. In different drafts, they were more antagonistic to each other. They get a real grudging friendship, which then becomes, they're each other's companions. Maybe they are each other's love of their lives. I don't know.
With your editors, you've had a very literal kill your darlings moment then.
Yes.
Was Meilin right not to marry Longwei?
I don't know. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. I think I think because of where I'm thinking it goes, it would have made things easier for Henry and Meilin getting her over to the US, obviously.
Yeah.
I wonder if, obviously we don't necessarily know because, you don't have a narrative from Longwei's point of view, but maybe that would have changed.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what I wanted with that difficulty in getting her to the US was I wanted the very thing that made it possible. Originally, the idea was the very thing that made it possible for them to leave China would be the very thing that made it impossible for her to eventually go to the US. And, that detail changes a little bit in the book. It's not the same, but it's kind of the same spirit. She's very stubborn. She's a very stubborn character. And I think...
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I think that stubbornness serves her really to her advantage at many points. And then also at other times, it's the idea that your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. And I just couldn't see her saying yes to marrying him. And in truth, my grandmother never did remarry. And as I researched the book and as I spoke to more and more people who knew family or were from that time, again and again, there was this shock that my own grandmother never remarried. They're like, what? She never remarried? She was a Weishengren. She would have been so desired because, of course, the Chinese who came over from China, they didn't want to marry the Taiwanese women because they thought that the Chinese women were better. So that really struck me. It's like, well, why didn't she marry in real life? I don't know why.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now you've made me think of other things as well with the documents and things like that. Obviously, in your novel, Meilin doesn't join Henry, but I mean, allowing for the historical and political context, could the details have been fixed and could she have moved with him?
So that is actually one of the tragic true facts of my family is that somehow my father's papers were such that his mother was never listed officially as his mother. And I think he tried to do a lot of things, but they couldn't manage it. I mean, I don't know why. It was listed like that. He did have a very powerful uncle, my father. And so my putting two and two together, trying to figure out, well, maybe if he was listed as his uncle's son, then maybe he would have had a better chance of getting to the US because it wasn't straightforward either to go from Taiwan to the US. I mean, you needed to be a very good student. You had to pass the political checks, because the Republic of China didn't just want anyone to go, and you needed to have some money and you needed to get a visa. Yeah, a lot of things had to line up for people in that generation to go to the US when my dad did, which is a little bit earlier. There were some more changes in legislations a little bit later in the 60s, which made it easier for people to from all around the world to emigrate to the US if they wanted to. And then again in the 80s, there were some more, with the opening of China, then you get a whole nother wave of Chinese diaspora going to the US again for different reasons. So to back up that opportunity for the kind of the last remaining son of a son of, in the book, it's the Dao family, I think it wasn't unusual for everyone to want to put all their resources into the son, thinking that, that would make the line carry on. So a huge amount of pressure when you think about it.
Yeah, definitely. No, I'm sorry to hear about your family situation.
Yeah. Somehow it worked out or didn't, it's the but yeah, I think that's something that really haunted my dad for a long time because there was nothing he could do about it. And, she had done so much for him. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. In this discussion, we're talking about Longwei, and Henry is consumed by a kind of a paranoia that he has something to fear for various reasons, and for good reasons. People have told him things. Was Longwei in a position that actually did make Henry's position fragile if he had done the wrong thing in the US?
I think he didn't know, and we don't know, but it was just the possibility that it could have been. I mean, Longwei is always, from the very beginning, he was always shady. From page 1, he's already doing strange deals with his father's kerosene company, before the war. He's never been someone who's entirely trustworthy or entirely straightforward. And this is something that the boy, Ren Shu doesn't really know because he just adores him. He's his uncle, but he starts to understand. And then I think this sort of cautiousness teetering over into paranoia becomes more and more real to Henry as he gets older, as he learns a little bit more about the world. And when he's in the US, he can't quite read all the different cues. And it's not only that he can't read all the cultural cues of being a Chinese immigrant in 1960s America, but the other Chinese immigrants who are there, students, they have different loyalties, they have different motivations for being there. There was a real sense at the time, historically, that the Kuomintang government or the nationalists, they were keeping an eye on all the Chinese students everywhere. I mean, today, Taiwan is lauded as a great democracy, and it is. But from 1945 or 49, I don't know how you want to do the counting, all the way up to 1987, it was a state under authoritarian martial rule. And there was one party, and that was the party of the nationalists. And while Chiang Kai-shek was alive, that was whatever he said was law. And you didn't dare say anything that contradicted any of his decisions. And if you were far away in America, the land of free speech and free press, that didn't matter because there was, spies in the sense of people who were just keeping an eye on what people were saying. And this is partially because bubbling up under this martial rule in Taiwan, there was an independence movement, which through the 80s and helped Taiwan get to where it is today as a democracy. And it's an area that I don't know quite enough about, but I do know enough that this democracy independence movement was starting, a lot of it in the US, where there was a little more freedom among Chinese student associations. And I think that all Henry knows is that Longwei is very powerful and seems to have connections. And you can't be powerful and have connections and not have some kind of association with the nationalist government. So he didn't want to cross that or lose that. Likely, yes, is I think the answer. I think it was a rational fear or a rational caution that maybe tipped over into paranoia, but completely understandable if you understand the bigger context of what he left behind and what he didn't know about what he left behind, because he just didn't know who his uncle's enemies and friends were, and just better to keep a super low profile and not find out in a unhelpful way or dangerous way.
Well, we've got Lily, her knowledge of her heritage is obviously affected by Henry keeping kind of stum about things and not permitting her to go to her Chinese lessons for very long and so on. This kind of goes back to your reading. Can we assume that with Henry opening up more to Lily, that the next generation on, Lily's children, are going to know more about their heritage and there's just going to be a lot more talk about what happened and stuff?
I think that's a lovely assumption. I hope so. Yes.
Good. Can I ask, I know this book is released recently. What's next?
Well, I'm getting there. I keep getting the question, what's next? And I've been asking myself that question too, since sort of the final edits were signed off. I have a lot of topic preoccupations, things that I've wanted to write about that don't yet have a story. So I'm interested in music. So that's sort of one abstract thing. I'm also interested in betrayal and relinquishing control and forgiveness. So those are sort of some of the themes that have been simmering. And now what I'm doing is I'm keeping my eyes out, and I think I might have a story. I'm looking for something that's a story that will be a vehicle to explore these ideas. And it's got to be a story that I want to live with for years because I take that long to write. It's the things that stop you in your tracks that I think are the things worth writing about. So when my mom told me about my dad's little peach trees, that stopped me in my tracks. And now we have this book. And so there was an article that I didn't want to say just because I'm just being cagey in case I back out. But I really thought I wanted to do this. And then the bloom was off. And over the last month or so, I've been thinking about it again. So yeah, I'm plotting.
Good. Okay, so Melissa, this has been absolutely lovely having you today. And absolutely fascinating listen to all the history and everything that's gone into your novel. I mean, when we started, I originally had a question to ask you about things you'd left out and things like that. And you've given us that and then some. It's been lovely. And yeah, just thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Charlie. It's been a delight. Thanks for asking me.
Links to purchase Peach Blossom Spring are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed today's discussion, do subscribe or follow the podcast on your listening app of choice. And please do review the podcast if you can. Reviews are incredibly valuable both in getting the word out there and also in terms of feedback. And reviews can be left on Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict and Podchaser. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 59, was recorded on the 1st of April and published on the 25th of April, 2022. Music and production by Charlie Place.